The wind swept across the golden plains of the west, carrying with it the scent of dust, wild sage, and the faint hum of cicadas that sang against the fading light. Evening had begun to stretch over the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of amber and violet. In that quiet hour, a young woman named Clara Whitfield stood by the edge of her family's small ranch house, a letter clutched tightly in her trembling hands. It was not just any letter, it was her escape. The letter came from a wealthy aunt in the East, offering Clara a place in her city home, far from the dry fields and weary faces of the small frontier town of Red Fern. Her aunt promised education, fine dresses, and a chance to start anew among people of status. For years, Clara had dreamed of more than dust, more than mending shirts, more than listening to the lonely creak of the barn door as her father came home empty, handed again. And yet, as she stood there, the paper shaking in her grip, her eyes drifted toward the hills where a single rider was returning from the south pasture. Jacob Carver. He was the ranch hand her father had taken in 3 years ago, a quiet man with kind eyes and a patience rare in the Wild West. Jacob worked hard, spoke little, and carried an air of calm that steadied even the harshest of days. To Clara, he had always been more than just a hand. His presence filled the spaces between her restless dreams, though neither of them had ever spoken of what lay between them. Clara turned the letter over, reading her aunt's fine handwriting one more time. Her father had already given his approval, proud that his daughter might have a better life. The townsfolk whispered that she'd be foolish not to go, but still her heart hesitated. Something inside her, some unexplainable pull, begged her to stay just a little longer. That night, as the lamps burned low, Clara sat at her small wooden desk, the letter folded neatly beside her. Outside, the coyotes howled, and the wind rattled the shutters. She looked out the window and saw the glow of the barn lantern Jacob, still working late. He always did, fixing fences, caring for horses, mending tools no one else bothered with. There was a steadiness to him that life in the city could never offer. But she shook the thought away. The city meant comfort, security, and maybe even love. Real love, not just the quiet, unspoken kind that hid between glances across the pasture. Days passed. Clara packed her few belongings, modest dresses, her mother's silver locket, and the books she loved. The stagecoach was set to leave in 2 days' time. Everyone congratulated her. Everyone except Jacob. He said nothing, but there was a distance in his gaze now, as though he'd already watched her leave. The night before her departure, a storm rolled in violent and unrelenting. The wind tore through the valley, breaking branches and scattering hay. The horses in the stable cried out, frightened by the thunder. Clara woke to the sound and ran to the barn, her shawl pulled tight against the rain. There, amid the storm's fury, she saw Jacob struggling to secure the barn doors. Without a word, she grabbed a rope and helped. The wind fought them, but together they managed to fasten the doors tight. Rain streamed down their faces, and for a moment their eyes met under the flickering lantern light. Time seemed to stop. The storm outside became distant. For just a second, Clara thought she saw in Jacob's eyes the same ache that had kept her from sealing her fate with that letter. But she said nothing, and neither did he. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the earth damp and glistening under a pale sun. Clara dressed for the journey, simple but tidy, and went to say her goodbyes. Her father was proud, though his voice cracked when he wished her luck. The coach would arrive by noon. She walked to the barn one last time, hoping to see Jacob, but he wasn't there. Only his hat hung on a nail by the door. Disappointment settled in her chest like dust. She left the barn quietly, telling herself it was better this way. But as she returned to the house, she noticed something tucked beneath the latch of her bedroom window, a folded piece of paper, rough and worn, sealed with a bit of string. Her name was scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting, Jacobs. Her hands shook as she opened it. The ink was slightly smudged, the writing uneven, as though done in haste. She read the first few lines, and her breath caught. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a confession, a letter that spoke of years of silent admiration, of moments he'd never had the courage to speak aloud. He wrote of how he saw her strength, her spirit, and her kindness. He wrote that the West might be hard, but it was also honest, and that his heart had found its home here, because of her. He didn't ask her to stay. He only wrote that if she chose to go, he would be proud, and if she chose to stay, he'd spend his life making sure she never regretted it. Clara sank onto her bed, the city letter in one hand, Jacob's in the other. The two paths stretched before her, one toward a life of comfort, the other toward uncertainty and wildness, but also something deeply real. Outside, the whistle of the approaching stagecoach echoed through the valley, and there she sat, between duty and desire, between the future promised and the future she might create for herself. The clock ticked, the horses neighed, the sound of the coach wheels grew louder. Clara closed her eyes. The wind slipped through the cracks of the old house, carrying with it the scent of rain and sage, the scent of home. And in that moment she made her choice, story idea. She held the letter that would take her away, until the cowboy wrote one that changed everything. The sound of the stagecoach wheels faded slowly into the horizon, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the faint echo of what might have been Clara Whitfield's last chance to leave Red Fern. But the coach had rolled on without her. Inside her room she sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the folded note that lay across her lap, the one written in Jacob Carver's rough but heartfelt handwriting. The letter had arrived like a whisper from fate, stopping her in her tracks just as she was about to step into a new life. The sunlight crept through the curtains, catching the edge of the paper. Her aunt's letter still lay on the nightstand, and pristine, elegant, a promise of wealth and comfort. But Jacob's letter, that was something else. It carried the weight of dirt roads, open skies, and quiet devotion. It wasn't polished, but it was real. For hours, Clara sat in silence, torn between what she had been told she wanted and what her heart whispered she needed. Every word he had written replayed in her mind his careful confession, his faith in her strength, his refusal to beg her to stay. There was something noble in that restraint, something deeply human. Outside, life at the ranch continued as if nothing had changed. Her father worked the fields, the hens scratched the dirt, and the wind rustled through the tall grass. But for Clara, everything had changed. She could feel it in her chest, the slow, steady ache of a decision made not by reason, but by the pull of something far greater. She didn't go to the city that day, nor the day after. The letter from her aunt remained unanswered. Days stretched into weeks, and life quietly folded back into its familiar rhythm. But there was a shift in the air now, one she couldn't ignore. Every time she caught sight of Jacob in the distance, leading the horses or mending a fence, her heart tightened in her chest. Still, he never mentioned the letter. He worked as he always had, steady, silent, unassuming. If he noticed she hadn't left, he gave no sign. Perhaps he thought she'd simply delayed her departure, or perhaps he was too proud to ask. But every now and then Clara would catch him glancing her way, and in that look there was something that felt like understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Clara took her sewing to the porch. The air was warm and soft, filled with the hum of crickets and the scent of sage. The horizon glowed with gold, and she could see Jacob leading the horses back to the stable, his figure outlined against the fading light. Something inside her stirred a quiet resolve. She realized that if she didn't act, the letter that had changed her heart might fade into memory like so many words carried away by the wind. And she couldn't let that happen. That night she wrote a letter of her own. It wasn't as refined as her aunt's or as raw as Jacob's, but it came from a place of truth. She wrote about her doubts, her fears, and how the thought of leaving had filled her with both excitement and dread. She wrote of the storm that had passed weeks before the night they'd fought the wind side by side, and how, in that chaos, she had found a strange kind of peace in his presence. But most of all, she wrote about home, not just the land, but the people, the simple life, the sense of belonging she had almost traded for a dream that wasn't truly hers. When the ink dried, she folded the letter carefully and sealed it. In the quiet of dawn, she slipped out of the house and walked toward the barn. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and blue, and the earth smelled fresh with dew. She found Jacob inside, as she knew she would, tending to the horses before the sun had fully risen. She didn't speak. She simply left the letter on the wooden table near the tack hooks and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, she paused, her heart hammering in her chest. The letter she had received from him still rested in her apron pocket, worn and creased from being read too many times. She reached for it, hesitated, then left it beside her own letter. The two envelopes lay there, his and hers, side by side, the story of two hearts told in ink and silence. For the rest of the morning, Clara went about her chores, trying to push the thought from her mind. The hours dragged by slowly, and she found herself glancing toward the barn every chance she got, but Jacob didn't come. Afternoon gave way to dusk, and the familiar ache of uncertainty returned. Had he read it? Had she made a mistake? Just as the first stars began to appear in the evening sky, Clara stepped outside. The wind carried the faint sound of horses in the distance. Then she saw him, Jacob, riding slowly toward the house, his hat pulled low, the setting sun casting long shadows behind him. He dismounted, tied his horse, and began walking toward the porch. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to ask what he thought, what he felt, whether the words she'd written had reached him the way his had reached her, but something stopped her. When he reached the steps, he simply tipped his hat, nodded once, and handed her a small folded slip of paper. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward the barn. She waited until he disappeared into the dim light before unfolding the paper. The message was short, barely more than a sentence, written in the same familiar hand. Some words don't need to be spoken twice. I'll be right here, however long it takes. Clara's heart swelled, a rush of warmth filling her chest. She didn't know what lay ahead, what her father might say, what the future might hold, but for the first time she felt unafraid. That night she sat by the window, watching the moon climb over the fields. The letters lay on her desk now, the ink faint under the soft glow of the lamp. Together they told the beginning of something that felt eternal. The city still waited, far away, but the sound of the wind and the distant neigh of horses reminded her of what truly mattered. She had come to the edge of leaving and found instead a reason to stay. Story idea, she held the letter that would take her away, until the cowboy wrote one that changed everything. The weeks that followed were quiet ones on the Whitfield ranch. The rains had passed, leaving behind open blue skies and long stretches of warm sun that baked the earth into shades of copper and gold. Life moved forward in its slow, steady rhythm, chores to be done, fences to mend, cattle to drive, and meals to prepare. But beneath that rhythm, something unspoken lingered between Clara and Jacob, like the low hum of the wind before a coming storm. The morning after she had received his second note, the one that said he would be right there, however long it took, Clara found herself looking for him without meaning to. She told herself it wasn't love, not yet. It was simply comfort, perhaps curiosity, or maybe gratitude for the courage he'd given her to stay. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was the quiet beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. Jacob kept his word, as he always did. He didn't press her or linger too close. He went about his work as though nothing had changed, though Clara often caught him watching her from across the field, a calm steadiness in his eyes that spoke louder than words. In the evenings she would sometimes sit outside, sewing under the dim light of the porch lantern, listening to the sounds of the night, the horses shifting in their stalls, the rustle of wind through the dry grass, and the faint hum of crickets. And more often than not, she would see Jacob walk toward the far edge of the property, to the small hill that overlooked the valley. He would stand there, hands in his pockets, staring at the horizon as though trying to read something only the sky could tell him. That hill had always been her mother's favorite spot, before she passed, where she would sit and watch the sunset after a long day's work. Clara hadn't been there in years, but one afternoon, after finishing her chores early, she climbed that hill for the first time since she was a girl. From the top, the view was breathtaking. The land stretched out endlessly, rolling in soft waves of green and gold. She could see the river glinting in the distance, and beyond it, the faint outline of the railroad that led east, the path she would have taken had she boarded that stagecoach. For a moment she imagined the life she had almost chosen, the city lights, the noise, the endless faces. And then she looked down toward the ranch, where the smoke from her father's chimney rose lazily into the clear blue sky. That was her life now, quiet, simple, and honest, the kind of life that asked more of the heart than the hand. A sense of peace settled over her, soft and unexpected. That evening, Jacob came by the porch to return a basket of fresh eggs he had collected from the hens. The air was cool, the sun dipping low. As he set the basket down, their eyes met, and something passed between them, something wordless but sure. For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't look away. The days that followed felt lighter. She found herself humming as she worked, smiling at small things, the smell of bread baking, the feel of the breeze on her face, the simple rhythm of life. It wasn't that her world had changed. It was that she had begun to see it differently. But life in the West never stayed still for long. Change had a way of finding even the quietest corners. One morning, a stranger rode into town. His clothes were fine, his boots polished, and his voice carried the accent of someone not from around there. He stopped by the Whitfield ranch to deliver a message from the city. Clara's aunt had written again. Her letter was short but stern. She wrote that she had heard of Clara's decision not to come and was disappointed. She reminded Clara of what she was giving up, a chance at a better life, a chance to rise above the hardship of ranch living. And at the end, she made one final offer. The train east would be leaving again in 3 weeks, and there would be a place for Clara if she chose to take it. The moment she finished reading, Clara felt the same ache in her chest that she had felt before, the tug between what she was expected to want and what her heart whispered to her instead. That evening she tucked the new letter into her apron pocket and went out to the pasture. The sun was setting again, casting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Jacob was there, fixing a section of the fence. She stood for a long moment watching him, feeling the pull of 2 different worlds within her. She didn't tell him about the letter that night. She couldn't, not yet. In the days that followed, she tried to ignore it. She worked harder, busied herself with chores, spent time with her father, But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the thought of that letter, waiting quietly in her drawer. It was as if the paper itself carried the weight of all her unanswered questions. Then one night, as the stars stretched high above the plains, she sat down at her desk again. The oil lamp flickered softly beside her. She took out both letters, her aunt's and Jacob's. One spoke of comfort, opportunity, and the world beyond. The other spoke of honesty, heart, and the life right in front of her. Her eyes lingered on Jacob's words. Some words don't need to be spoken twice. I'll be right here however long it takes. Something inside her broke open. The next morning, she rose before dawn and went out to the hill again. The valley was quiet, wrapped in the soft hush of early light. She thought of everything she might be giving up: silk dresses, grand houses, and fine manners, and realized that none of it could replace the simple warmth she felt here. The decision she had once feared now felt clear, but the story of her heart wasn't done yet. Life, as always, had its own way of testing what was real, because just as she descended the hill that morning, she saw Jacob speaking with a man near the gate. The stranger held a letter in his hand, addressed to Jacob this time. His face was unreadable as he took it, his brow furrowed slightly. And when their eyes met, Clara felt something shift. That letter, she knew, somehow was about to change everything again. End of Chapter 3. To be continued in Chapter 4. Story idea: she held the letter that would take her away, until the cowboy wrote one that changed everything. The sun rose over the Whitfield ranch that morning like any other, warm and quiet, painting the fields in shades of amber. The air smelled of dew and hay, the horses stirring lazily in the corral. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. A new letter had arrived, and though it wasn't meant for Clara, its weight could be felt in the air around them. Jacob had received it from a man who rode in from the south, a stranger wearing the dust of a long journey. Clara had watched the exchange from the porch, her hands still and her breath caught. She didn't know who the letter was from, but she saw how Jacob's eyes darkened as he unfolded the paper. He didn't speak. He only folded it back up, tucked it into his coat, and walked off toward the hill without another word. For the rest of the day, he was nowhere to be seen. The silence that followed unsettled Clara more than she expected. Over the past few months, she had grown used to the sound of him, his boots on the gravel, the low hum of his voice as he worked, the way he'd whistle softly at sunset. But that day, the ranch felt emptier, as though something essential had gone missing. That evening, when the work was done and the sky burned in streaks of gold and crimson, she found herself walking toward the hill once more. There she saw him standing just as he always did, still, quiet, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. He didn't turn when she approached, but she could sense the storm within him. In his hands he held the letter. It was creased and worn already, as if he had opened and read it 100 times. She could tell by the way his shoulders tensed that whatever it said had shaken him deeply. That night, long after he'd gone, she sat awake by her window, the oil lamp burning low. She thought of the letter her aunt had sent, the one urging her to leave, and how easily a few lines of ink on paper could change a life. She wondered what Jacob's letter had said, who had written it, and what power did it hold over him now. The days that followed grew heavy with distance. Jacob was there, but he wasn't there. He worked harder than before, riding out early and coming back long after dusk. His silence spoke louder than any words could have. Clara tried to focus on her chores, but her thoughts drifted again and again to that letter. It seemed the both of them were bound by words neither had asked for, hers calling her away, his pulling him somewhere she couldn't yet see. Then, one afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds crawling across the horizon, lightning splitting the sky. The wind howled through the valley, sending the cattle running for cover. Clara was in the barn, trying to secure the doors when she saw Jacob gallop in, soaked through, his horse foaming and died. Without a word, he dismounted, handed the reins to her, and disappeared into the house. She finished tying down the gate and followed him inside moments later. The letter lay open on the table, the ink blurred from rain. She couldn't help but see the name written at the top, a name she didn't recognize. Her heart sank as she read what little she could make out. It spoke of land in Texas, of a ranch in need of a foreman, and of opportunity waiting if he chose to take it. It wasn't just any offer. It was a chance for Jacob to start a new life, one that didn't tie him to this place. That night, as thunder rolled across the sky, Clara realized the cruel twist of fate. Just as she had been tempted to leave, now it was he who might be called away. The same force that had tested her resolve was now testing his, and for the first time she understood what love really demanded, not just the choice to stay, but the courage to let someone go if they must. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost hollow. Clara went about her chores in silence, every sound seeming sharper in the emptiness. The creak of the barn door, the clink of metal against wood. When Jacob finally appeared, his face was calm, but his eyes were far away. He told her, in his quiet, steady way, that he'd be leaving for Texas in a week's time. There was work to be done there, good work, honest work, and it would give him the chance to build something of his own. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She didn't argue. She didn't ask him to stay. The words caught in her chest, heavy as lead. That night she found herself holding her own letter again, the one from her aunt. It had felt like a lifeline once, a promise of escape. But now, looking at it, she saw it for what it truly was, a door she no longer needed to walk through. And then she did something she hadn't done before. She sat down at her small desk, took out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write, not to her aunt, but to Jacob. The pen trembled in her hand as she wrote about the life they had built here, the long days and the quiet evenings, the shared silences that had said more than words ever could. She wrote of how the ranch had changed since he'd come, how she had changed. And finally, she wrote the truth, the thing she had been afraid to say out loud, that if he left, this place would never feel the same again. When she was done, she folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and slipped it into his coat pocket hanging by the door. The next morning, Jacob left before dawn. Clara stood at the porch as the first light crept across the horizon, watching him ride away. His figure grew smaller with each passing second until he disappeared beyond the hills. The world around her seemed to fall silent again, the only sound, the faint rustle of wind through the grass. But in her heart there was something new, a stillness, yes, but not of despair. It was the quiet ache of hope, the kind that waits patiently for what it believes will return. She turned back toward the house, the firelight flickering softly inside. On the table lay her aunt's letter untouched, unopened this time. As she picked it up, she realized she didn't need to read it anymore. Her choice had already been made, and now it was his turn to make his. Far down the road, Jacob rode on through the dawn, unaware of the folded paper in his pocket, the letter that would change his course just as surely as hers once had. And as the sun climbed higher over the plains, two hearts carried the weight of the same question, written now in different hands. Would love wait long enough for them to find their way back? Story idea, she held the letter that would take her away, until the cowboy wrote one that changed everything. The early dawn carried with it a stillness that felt almost sacred, the kind that only follows a storm. The air smelled clean, the earth soft beneath the hooves of Jacob's horse as he rode through the waking plains. He didn't know where the road would take him, not truly, but something inside him urged him onward. The letter from Texas lay folded in his saddlebag, its promise echoing like a whisper he couldn't shake. He had left before sunrise, before anyone could see him go. Yet as he rode, something felt unfinished, like a door left half open in his soul. He told himself it was just the land he was leaving behind, but deep down, he knew there was more to it than that. By noon, the sun hung high and hot, and he stopped near a shallow stream to rest his horse. He reached into his coat to pull out a piece of jerky, but his fingers brushed against something soft instead. A folded paper. He frowned, pulling it free. It wasn't the letter from Texas. This one was smaller, sealed in haste, with his name written across the front in a hand he recognized instantly. Clara's. For a moment he simply stared at it, his breath caught between disbelief and something deeper. He thought of her standing on the porch as he left, her eyes following him even as the distance swallowed his shape. He broke the seal carefully. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read. Her words were simple but filled with quiet strength. She wrote about the ranch, the way it had come to feel alive again since he'd been there. She spoke of mornings that felt lighter, evenings that didn't ache with loneliness the way they once had. She told him he had built something more than fences and corrals. He had built peace. And then she wrote of herself. She wrote of the letter that had once promised her a life somewhere far away, a letter she had nearly followed out of fear, not hope. But now, she said, she had learned that not all letters were meant to be obeyed. Some were meant to be rewritten. The last lines were what stopped him cold. If you must go, I won't stand in your way, but know that this place, this life, we built it together, and if you ever turn back, you won't be coming home to an empty house. You'll be coming home to me. Jacob lowered the paper slowly, his throat tight, his breath caught in the soft rush of the wind. For the first time in a long while, he felt lost, and not in the way a man feels when he's gone astray, but in the way one feels when they realize they've been heading in the wrong direction all along. He stayed there by the stream until the sun began to fall, its golden light dancing across the water. The letter lay in his lap, worn at the folds from where he'd read it over and over again. The words clung to him, filling the silence with a warmth that stirred something he thought he'd buried long ago. The belief that maybe, just maybe, love could be stronger than the call of distance or duty. When he finally rose to mount his horse again, he didn't turn south toward Texas. He turned back. The road home felt longer this time, but lighter somehow. Each mile brought a flood of memories, the sound of Clara's laugh drifting from the kitchen, the scent of bread baking at dusk, the way her hair caught the sunlight as she worked in the yard. Those moments, simple as they were, now seemed like threads weaving a picture of everything he'd ever wanted without knowing it. He rode through the night, guided by starlight and memory. Back at the ranch, the days stretched quiet. Clara moved through them with a rhythm she'd learned to carry alone, feeding the hens, tending the horses, keeping the fire burning. But even as she worked, she couldn't help but glance toward the ridge each evening when the sun began to sink. It had been 3 days since he left, 3 days that felt like a lifetime. Each night she sat by the window, her lamp glowing faintly in the dark, the wind whispering through the open fields. And each night she wondered whether he had found his new beginning, or whether, somehow, he had found a reason to come back. The morning he returned, the world was quiet. The first sign of him wasn't the sound of his horse's hooves. It was the faint silhouette of a man against the breaking light, steady and certain, riding toward the house. Clara saw him before she truly believed it was him, For a moment she stood frozen, her breath caught between hope and disbelief. Then the sound reached her, the familiar rhythm of his horse's steps, the soft creak of leather and saddle, and her heart knew before her mind could catch up. Jacob dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with the weight of a decision made. He reached into his coat, and this time it wasn't her letter he held, it was one of his own. He placed it on the porch, railing before her, and turned, as if giving her the choice he hadn't had. Then, without a word, he walked toward the barn. The letter was short, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had never been good with words, but meant every one of them. You once wrote that not all letters should be obeyed. You were right. Some are meant to be answered, and this is mine. I'm not going anywhere, not while home still looks like you. The world around her blurred. The tears came before she could stop them. Tears not of sadness, but of something gentler, something that had waited too long to be spoken. The ranch, which had felt empty for days, now breathed again. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, the air hummed with a quiet sense of peace. The horses grazed lazily in the pasture. The air smelled faintly of rain, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly as it should. Jacob worked by the barn until the sky turned gold, his movements easy and unhurried. Clara stood by the porch, watching, the letter resting close to her heart. Some stories begin with words written in ink. Others begin with the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Theirs somehow was both, and as night fell over the plains, the stars blinked to life above them, like old promises being kept. But though peace had settled for now, one truth lingered in the air between them, something neither of them yet knew. That love, once written, never truly ends. It only waits for the next page to turn. Story idea. She held the letter that would take her away, until the cowboy wrote one that changed everything. The sun rose softly over the horizon, casting long golden ribbons across the open plains. The land looked peaceful that morning, wrapped in the quiet kind of stillness that comes after a storm of the heart. The old ranch stood proudly against the morning light, weathered, strong, and alive once again. For the first time in years, it felt like home. Clara stood by the window, her hands resting gently on the worn frame, watching as Jacob worked in the yard. He moved with calm certainty, the kind of rhythm that comes when a man is no longer running from himself. There was peace in his step now, and though neither of them had spoken much since his return, the silence between them carried more truth than any words ever could. The letter he had written, crumpled slightly at the corners from her trembling hands, lay on the small table beside her. She had read it more times than she could count. Each line, each word, seemed to carry a warmth that reached beyond the page. It wasn't just a confession, it was a promise that love could be written not just in ink, but in actions, in presence, in the choice to stay. Days passed like pages, turning in a slow, beautiful story. The ranch thrived again under their shared care. The fields stretched green and full, the horses ran free, and the house, once heavy with the weight of loneliness, filled with laughter again, even if only in small, quiet bursts. Jacob had begun mending more than fences. He had started fixing the roof, restoring the barn, planting new seeds in the earth. And with every nail hammered, every row tilled, he built something unseen but deeply felt, a foundation that no storm could shake. Clara, too, had found her place once more. She moved through the days with renewed purpose, her energy flowing back into the land that had once seemed to reject her. She baked bread again, humming softly to herself. She tended the flowers by the porch that had wilted in her absence. And every evening she set 2 plates at the table, even before Jacob came in from the fields. But even as life settled into this new, fragile balance, a question lingered quietly in her heart. What would become of the letter she once held, the one that was meant to take her away, the letter that promised a new beginning somewhere else, far from the dust and the memories of this land? It lay hidden now in the drawer by her bedside, unopened since that day. It was a symbol of all the choices she could have made, but didn't. One afternoon, as the wind carried the faint scent of rain across the valley, Clara found herself standing in her room, staring at that drawer. Her hands hesitated before pulling it open. The envelope was still there, yellowed slightly at the edges, the ink faint but clear. Her name was written across it in the same formal hand that had once made her heart race with hope. She held it carefully, her breath steady but her thoughts tangled. That letter had once been her escape, a door to a world beyond fences and heartbreak. But now it felt like a remnant of a life that no longer belonged to her. As she stood there, the door creaked softly behind her. Jacob was at the threshold, his hands still dusty from the fields. He didn't say a word, but his eyes drifted to the envelope in her hands. And though no sound passed between them, understanding did. Without hesitation, Clara walked to the hearth. The fire burned low, its embers glowing like quiet stars. She paused for a moment, then let the letter fall into the flames. It curled and blackened quickly, the paper dissolving into ash, its promises lifting into the air like smoke, carried off by the wind. She turned to him then, her expression calm, resolved. The past had been written in one letter, but the future, she realized, would be written in another, his. That evening, as twilight stretched across the plains, they sat together on the porch. The world was quiet except for the distant hum of crickets and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. The sky blazed with color, deep golds fading to violet, and for a while they simply watched the day fade into night. Jacob leaned back in his chair, his hat resting low over his brow, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. For years he had thought of love as something fleeting, something the land could take as easily as it gave. But now he knew better. Love wasn't a storm or a spark. It was steady, like the sunrise. It grew in the quiet moments, in the shared work, in the unspoken choices that shaped two lives into one. Later that night, as the lamps flickered low, Jacob sat at the small wooden table inside the house, pen in hand. He took out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. His handwriting was rough, uneven, but honest. He wrote about the land, how it had given him purpose again, about Clara, how her strength had mended more than the walls of the ranch, and about himself, how the man he had become was because of her. When he was done, he folded the letter neatly and left it on her side of the table, beneath the soft glow of the lamp. By morning, the sun poured through the window, and Clara found it waiting for her. She read it slowly, her heart swelling with every word. It wasn't grand or poetic. It didn't need to be. It was a letter of truth, written by a man who had learned that love wasn't something you chased across the horizon. It was something you built, one moment at a time, in the same place you once thought to leave behind. You held a letter that could have taken you away. It read, "But now we both hold the kind that keeps us here." Tears welled in her eyes as she folded the paper carefully and placed it beside his on the shelf, where both letters, his and hers, would stay. One a memory of what could have been, the other a testament to what was. Outside, the day unfolded quietly. The fields shimmered under the sun, the horses moved gracefully in the pasture, and the wind carried a soft hum through the air that sounded almost like a song. The past had written its final line. The future, unwritten but waiting, stretched wide and endless before them. And as Jacob and Clara stood together, side by side on the porch, watching the horizon glow in the distance. There was no need for words, because some endings don't need to be spoken. They're simply lived